Memorial Day reminds us that many times in the life of this nation, a way forward was made at terrible cost. If you study history at all, you know that men died so this nation could be born instead of remaining under British rule. Men died so this nation would not tear itself apart and leave millions in chains. And men died across oceans, on beaches, in forests, in skies, so that our children would not be swallowed up by tyranny. And in our own generation, men and women have given their lives in distant deserts, mountains, villages, city streets, standing between our homes and the violence of Islamic terrorism. They gave their lives to make a way forward for people like me and you, and for their descendants they would never meet, in a future they would never see. So I think Memorial Day should remind us that memory is not automatic. You know, we kind of need to be told to remember things at times, kind of like Thanksgiving tells us we should give thanks for things. Memorial Day calls us to remember. You know, a nation can receive freedom and forget how they got it and how they've kept it. And I think the people of God, if we're not careful, we can forget as well. We can stand on the far side of things that God has done for us and slowly, maybe without meaning to, forget exactly what he did. And maybe we begin to think that we arrived there on our own power, through our own wisdom and courage and goodness. But the Bible continually says something different. And that's certainly true in our passage today in Joshua 4. God had made a way for Israel where there was no way. But he knew that this miracle would fade from their memory and people would forget about the amazing thing that was done if the memory wasn't protected and guarded. So before Israel could move into the promised land and begin its conquest, God had some special instructions for them. He commanded them to stop and to take stones from the riverbed and build a memorial that would stand. And it would remember and help people remember exactly what God had done, how he made a miraculous way for them to cross the Jordan. And if you have your Bible, let's read about it. We're going to be in Joshua chapter 4, and I'll start in verse 1. When all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, Take 12 stones from here out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight." Then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he had appointed, a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, "Pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, that this may be a sign among you when your children ask in time to come, what do those stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever." Joshua 4 takes place in one of the great turning points of Israel's story. Moses has died, and Joshua is now leading the people. The wilderness years of wandering under God's judgment, those were over, and the promised land awaits them. The promised land lies before them, but Israel would have to cross over the Jordan River at flood stage, which was not going to be a very easy endeavor to do. In Joshua 3, the priests carry the ark of the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant. If you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, they carried it into the water. And as they were doing so, God cuts off the water. The river stops flowing, and it just goes away where they can walk across the riverbed on ground. And God commanded them to take 12 stones where the priests had been standing in the middle of the riverbed with the ark, so that moment would not disappear, that it would not leave their memory as the waters returned. Israel was not allowed to enter the land as if they had brought themselves there or they had done it themselves. That's not how God set it up. He wanted them to know that He did this. Through His power, He made a way for them to enter the promised land. And when God makes a way, number one, we need to remember what God has done. When God makes a way, we need to remember what God has done. In verse 1, the passage opens with, after all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan. And I think that phrase, it's important. Not just some people went across. Everybody went across. Older people, younger people, children. I'm sure there were babies and moms and everything else. God didn't open up the river for just the strongest to make it across and leave the weak behind. He did not begin a mercy that He wouldn't finish. He brought everybody across. And the word here, passing over, is a word of crossing, a word of movement, and here it carries the idea of a completed passage. Israel had moved from the wilderness, from God's judgment. They had crossed over when God made a way. They had crossed over into their inheritance from a promise that had always been in the distance. Well, now it was going to be under their feet. And they were going to be living as they received this promise. The whole nation crossed over before or after God made a way, and now He commands them to remember the way that He has made. And then in verses 2 through 3 that I read, God tells Joshua to appoint men, one from each tribe, one from each of the 12 tribes, and command them to take stones. And if you look at that phrase, it says, from the midst of the Jordan. Do you see that? The midst of the Jordan. And the detail there is kind of the heart of the point. The stones were not taken from the bank where people had gathered safely on the other side. No, they were taken from the middle of the riverbed, where the priests had stood firmly with the Ark of the Covenant, where God's presence had made a way where no way could be made. It would be an unmistakable remembrance of what He had done. These stones came from, I guess you could say, the hidden floor of the miracle. They would later stand as a visible witness to Israel of what God had done for them when they left behind the desert and came into the promised land. Those stones would bear witness. And it would remind people of what God had done for them. Then notice the rest of verse 3 and how it kind of moves into verses 4 and 5. It says the stones came from that very place where the priest's feet stood firmly. God told them what to do, and the priests did it. And the people followed after the priests, and they crossed safely to the other side. And so that's kind of the epicenter of the miracle where they're taking these from. And notice these weren't small stones. It told them to pick it up and put it on their shoulder. Do you see it? So this isn't like a little rock pile. It would actually take you some doing to get that stone up to the bank and to build it. So they weren't carrying a decoration. This was more of a testimony. Israel needed to remember that God did this, they did not do it. God made the way, they didn't make a way. God did what they could never do on their own power. And I think that's why remembering what God has done, it's not optional for people that say they follow the Lord. We've got to remember what God has done for us. We are far too capable of standing on dry ground and saying, look what I did. Look how far I've come. Look what I did on my own power, all by myself. Right? We're capable of doing that if we're not careful. We can look at the life we have, the blessings we enjoy, the strength we've received, the doors that opened up for us miraculously, the dangers that did not destroy us, and begin to think that, well, we did this, we emerged, we struggled and made it through all on our own. But every believer, I think, has stones that they should be carrying out of the riverbed, from the hidden floor of the miracle that God has wrought in their life. There are places in your life where God held back what could have swept you away. There are seasons where God gave you firm footing when everything else was turbulent and swirling all around you. There are mercies you did not create. There's deliverance that you could not engineer. And there have been crossings in your life that you could not do on your own power. All of us have them. All of us have those things. And the question is not only whether God's made a way. I think the question is whether you have remembered it rightly. Do you remember the things that God has done for you, where he's made his power available to you and he's made a way for you? Have you named that mercy, or have you treated it just like it's ordinary life? Have you carried any stones from the middle of some place that God had carried you across, or have you let the waters just sweep over the memory and you've forgotten what God has done? So Memorial Day reminds us that a nation can forget the cost of its freedom. And I think Joshua 4 reminds us that God's people were capable of forgetting what God has done for us. That's why he commands them in here to build this memorial. When God makes a way, we can't move forward like we've done it ourselves. We need to stop. We need to remember. And we need to say with humility and gratitude that God brought me here. God held me up. God made the way. In Washington, D.C., there's a National World War II memorial. And on that memorial, there's a bronze plaque that contains some words of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. On the evening of D-Day, after Americans had learned that Allied forces had landed in Normandy, FDR went on national radio and led the country in prayer. The invasion was one of those moments when a way forward had to be made across water, through danger, under fire, at terrible cost. Young men stepped out of landing craft under enemy fire. They crossed beaches and cliffs, field and town, so that others could live in a world that was not swallowed up in tyranny. And I think what is striking about Roosevelt's prayer, and I would encourage you to go look it up and read it, is that he didn't speak as if victory rested only on planning and weapons and mere human courage or force of arms. No, he prayed specifically. He asked God to lead them straight and true, to give strength to their arms and stoutness to their hearts and steadfastness to their faith. Later in the prayer, he said, "With thy blessing we shall prevail over the unholy forces of our enemy." And then he confessed, "We know that by thy grace and by the righteousness of our cause, our sons will triumph." They asked for God's help, and God delivered. God delivered. That's the right kind of memory. It honors the courage of those that landed, but it doesn't forget how God was petitioned to make a way, and that he did. That he did make a way for them. That's exactly what the stones in Joshua 4 were supposed to do, was to remind people of what God had done. They were not there to say, look what Israel had accomplished. They were there to say, look at what God has done. And that's how it's supposed to be in our lives. Anything we have, anything, God has had a part of it. When God makes a way, we need to remember what God has done. And then number two, we need to pass down what God has done. We need to pass down what God has done. In verse 6, God says the stones will be a sign among you. Do you see that? A sign, is not meant to merely draw attention to itself, but it points beyond itself. It tells you about things. It makes you think of something else. It's symbolic of something more. And these stones were not magic stones, sacred relics, or decorations for the camp, right? They were visible witnesses to the invisible mercy of God. They stood among Israel so that every generation that would be coming along might see these stones and wonder, well, what are they there for? Why are these stones stacked up here at the Jordan? And it was going to be a reminder that they were there not from their military skill or their endurance or their courage or their intelligence or their planning, but they were there because of God and His power. Those stones were saying that God had acted. He brought His people out of the desert, brought them across the Jordan, and He gave them something they could never do on their own. They never could have gotten there under their own power. Then God gives the purpose of this sign in verse 6. When your children ask in time to come, saying, what do these stones mean to you? God instructed them to build this memorial for a question that had not yet been asked. And it's kind of a beautiful detail when you think about it. God was already thinking about the coming generations. He was already thinking about children who had never seen the Jordan open, who hadn't seen His miraculous power displayed. They would grow up in a land, they would enjoy the inheritance that God had given them without ever understanding everything it took to get there. So He gave Israel a sign that would make the next generation curious. That's what He did. The stones were meant to interrupt ordinary life. It was meant to make someone ask, why are they there? A child might see them and wonder about them and ask what they meant. Then the older generation could speak and explain why the stones were there. They could recall what God had done when He displayed their power and they crossed the Jordan. Then in verse 7, God gives the answer Israel must pass down. The waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Israel wasn't supposed to say, well, we crossed the Jordan. It's supposed to be more than that. It was supposed to be more important than that. They were supposed to say, God cut off the waters. God, severed the barrier. God interrupted what could have stopped us, what could have kept us from getting to the promised land. God used His power to make a way for us. These stones, it says, would be a memorial forever. Not because the stones were impressive, but because God's mercy that He displayed should be remembered forever. And here we are all these years later, and we still remember. We're talking about it today in 2026 about what God did millennia ago. It's amazing. God wanted them to pass down what He had done. This means our memories of God's mercy in our lives, they're not supposed to be private treasures, private memories. They're meant to become testimony. Your children, your grandchildren, younger believers in the church, and people who come behind you need more than some vague sense that you believed in God. They need more than that. They need to hear what God has done. They need to know where God carried you, where He corrected you, how He provided for you, where He protected you, and how at times He made a way for you when you could not make a way for yourself. If we never tell them, if we never pass it down, what God has done, well, the next generation, they may inherit our church buildings, our traditions, our songs, our Bible, but never understand the mercies of God that made those things precious to us. Tell them when God made a way. Tell them how he saved you. Tell them what your life was like before Christ and how the Lord brought you out. Tell them about the prayers he answered, the sins that he forgave, the doors he opened, the grief that he carried you through, the dangers he spared you from, the seasons where it felt like you had no strength left, and yet God kept on providing. Those are the things we need to pass down to the next generation. The next generation does not need polished religious language that makes your life sound more holy than it was. They need realism. They need sincerity. They need honest testimony about what God has done from people who have experienced God's deliverance in their lives. That's what they need. They need to point at those stones and say, God brought me through. God held me up. God made the way. A young woman was helping to clean out her grandmother's house after the funeral. And most of what they found was ordinary. Dishes, towels, old pictures, boxes of cards, the little things of life that are left behind when a person dies. But in the bottom drawer of a nightstand, wrapped in cloth, she found her grandmother's Bible. It was worn soft from years and years of use. The cover was cracked. The pages had notes in the margins, names written beside verses, dates beside promises, and little lines only her grandmother probably understood. Beside one psalm, she had written the year God carried me after my husband died. Near a passage in Romans, she had written the day I knew I was forgiven. And in the back, there were names of children and grandchildren with dates and things written for each of them where she had prayed and God had delivered again and again and again. And the young woman sat on the floor and she was reading through all of these notes in her grandmother's Bible. And for the first time, she realized that her grandmother's faith was real and dynamic. It wasn't a vague, sentimental kind of religion. No, it was more than that. It had been a testimony. And what she was reading, well, that was a testimony for the next generation. She left behind some stones. She marked places where God made a way, where God held her up, where God answered prayer, where God forgave sin, where God gave her strength to keep on going. And even after her voice was long gone from this earth, those stories, they were still speaking. They were still speaking to the next generation. And that's what Joshua 4 is about. The next generation needs more than the fact that we believed. They need to know what God has done. They need someone who will point to the stones and say, here, God made a way. Memorial Day reminds us that forgetfulness, it's possible, right? People can receive freedom and forget what it cost. A family can inherit a name and forget the sacrifices behind it and everything that led to them being alive right here and now. And the people of God, we can stand on the far side of mercy and forget all the prayers God has answered, all the deliverances he has wrought, all the dangers that he's brought us through. And that's why God gave Israel those stones. The river would flow again. The eyewitnesses to this incredible, miraculous event would get old and they would die, but the stones would remain standing in the life of Israel, asking every generation the same question: do you remember who made the way? Who made the way? We're not self-made people. We're not. We're not self-saved people. Are we? Whatever good we have, whatever mercy we have received, whatever strength carried us when we had none, whatever forgiveness restored us after we had fallen, all of those things come from the hand of our loving Heavenly Father. He does that. We don't. So remember what God has done, and don't keep it buried inside of your heart. Tell the people coming after you what God has done, how he saved you. Tell them where you were, where he found you, how he forgave you, what he healed, what he carried, what he changed, and how he made a way for you at times when you could not make one for yourself. Don't let your testimony die with you. Don't let your children and grandchildren inherit only your possessions or your habits or your religious routines without knowing God's mercies that shaped the trajectory of your life. Speak it while you can. Tell them truly, God saved me. God carried me. God made the way.